In 1914, a conflict would begin in Europe, which would only ramp up into the war we know of today as World War I. Just 3 years later, in 1970, after Germany had deliberately sunk many merchant boats off the coast of England, the United States would enter the war. While America would send more than 1 million troops over to Europe to support the Allies, we also supported by sending over weapons, munitions, and other raw materials needed for a successful and well-resourced army. American manufacturing was poised to take on the task of being a primary creator for many of the countries in Europe during the war. Among those taking advantage of the inflated prices European countries were willing to spend on many products was the T.A. Gillespie shell loading plant. One of the largest munition factories during World War I, this ammunition factory in Sayreville, New Jersey, primarily produced artillery shells as well as ammunition. Founded in 1852 meant this factory was equipped with proper machinery, staffing, and know-how to maximize the output and produce at a very high level. Having employed over 6,000 workers at the time, working around the clock, this plant was able to manufacture whatever the Allies across the Atlantic could request. Unfortunately, the practices this factory used for manufacturing would come to a head on October 4th, 1918. The direct origin of the explosion is still unknown, but the leading theory by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is that at approximately 7:45 p.m., a bad combination of scrap metal and TNT in Building 611 would create a series of explosions, the whole factory being filled with raw materials that are conducive to exploding and very flammable, would cause a subsequent series of explosions that would continue for 3 days. The plant would also be housing ammunition awaiting departure for the war. This in turn made the aftermath of the original explosion much worse. In total, 6 kilotons of TNT would be ignited and explode over the 3-day period. Among those involved in the rescue operations were the U.S. Coast Guard, stationed just across the Raritan River in Perth Amboy. 12 Navy men would receive Navy Crosses for their heroic actions during the rescue mission. The award citations indicate that during the fire, the group of 14 would risk death when they moved a train loaded with TNT that was on the edge of the fire. Ultimately, 2 of the 14 would die during this mission. Government authorities in the days after the fire would declare martial law and order the evacuation of 62,000 people. Unfortunately, the mass movement would leave the evacuated and the homeless in the area very susceptible to a severe influenza pandemic that would strike in the weeks after. While the exact death toll is unknown due to many of the employee records being destroyed in the fires, the total is believed to be about 100 people dead, with hundreds more injured. As a result, one of the largest manufacturing plants in the U.S. would be destroyed, as well as over 300 of the surrounding buildings, and would force the evacuation and reconstruction of the Sayreville, South Amboy, and Lawrence Harbor area. Debris would be found in a 1.2-mile radius around the initial explosion, and over a century later, you can still find remnants of this explosion buried in Middlesex County. Throughout the 90s and even in 2007, unexploded ordnance would be discovered during construction of various schools in the area, and just between those 3 instances, over 5,000 pieces of ordnance was found and later destroyed. Damage to the plant was estimated to be at $18 million, and the U.S. government would pay out $300 million in today's money in insurance payments to the area residents for damages. The final report would say that 6 kilotons of explosive material would be destroyed in the explosion, and that material would prove to be enough ammunition to supply the Western Front in the war for 6 months. While hundreds of detonations were spread over the 3 days, the totality of the event ranked as one of the largest man-made non-nuclear explosions in history. Some of the strongest individual blasts were from the exploding storehouses or rail cars that were full of ammunition. These explosions would break windows as far away as Manhattan and Asbury Park, more than 20 miles away in distance. Many victims would be disintegrated in the explosion, and the unidentified remains of 18 workers would be buried in a mass grave off Ernston Road. After the war had finished, the plant would go through many name changes in the early 1920s before completely stopping manufacturing in 1923, where the company would disappear after some time. And that is the story of one of the largest disasters in American wartime manufacturing. If you want to hear more scary, fascinating stories, make sure to check out last week's video.